Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 7 of Pumpin Iron, the review series for the classic muscle cars of GT6. And in this episode we're featuring what is pretty much the slowest muscle car in the game, which is of course Mario Andretti's 1948 Hudson Hornet Racer. One of the most unique cars in the game because it has obviously unfinished bodywork, and as I said, it is technically speaking the slowest muscle car in the game. So why should you want or not want to buy one? Well, at $500,000 credits it's a very expensive machine, considering that it is, as we said, the slowest muscle car you can buy, especially considering that many muscle cars are actually very reasonably priced. Now, of course, the main reason for that is its historical significance. It's a legendary car, and that's why it's expensive. So what does it have to offer for that money? Well, fully tuned, which isn't very much tuning at all, really, it produces 208 brake horsepower, which is, for a 1948 car, not too bad. It also produces a respectable 394 pound-feet of torque. And despite being a pretty big vehicle overall, it weighs a very impressive 1,292 kilos, which is very reasonable for a vehicle of its size. Many people don't realise just how big a car this is. And incidentally, its PP, when fully tuned, sits at 411, which is pretty low. There's not many vehicles that really race at the 411 pp category. Some people may do it for a bit of fun, but that's a pretty specialist niche, especially for a muscle car. You'd have to de-restrict or restrict even many of the muscle cars severely to get them down to that level. And incidentally, this car has a power to weight ratio of a not surprisingly uninspiring 161 horsepower per tonne. So far it doesn't exactly sound like a good deal for $500,000 credits. And from a performance point of view, it's not really that great for the money. However, there is a caveat on that, because although obviously it's completely uncompetitive against the other muscle cars when they're fully tuned, it is pretty competitive at the 400 pp level. Now obviously you have to detune it a bit to get it down to 400 pp, but at that level all cars are slow. So the fact that this car is slower than its rivals doesn't make as much of a difference at that level. And because of not having to restrict the car so much, the performance that you can still get from it is actually pretty decent. Now acceleration and top speed wise, it isn't going to break any records, obviously, but it's not quite as slow as you might think. It gives you pretty decent lap times, and the main reason for that is actually the handling. Now, as we already said, it's a pretty big car, but it handles far better than it really has any right to. The brakes are very good. Granted, they don't have all that much power to deal with, but still, many old vehicles, even non-performance models, have awful handling and awful brakes. So the fact that this car handles and stops so well is a testament to it. Now in real life, of course, the Hudson Hornet was a very successful car in racing, whereas on the game it's kind of outclassed by the more modern stuff, and even by most of the classics. But in its own little niche, it's a pretty effective car, and the handling is far better than you'd expect it to be. In fact, I'd say overall the handling on this car is probably its best point. There's so much grip, surprisingly, that it pretty much never wheel spins, and some corners you can actually take full throttle that no other muscle car in the game could do. So it's certainly pretty good at its own little niche. The problem overall, though, is that that niche is so restrictive. So overall, is it worth $500,000? Well, it depends on what you class as being worth. Value is, well, there's multiple ways of putting a value on something. You can value something based on how good it is, or you can value something on how much you personally like it, or historical significance, and etc. Now for performance, obviously it's not worth 500,000 credits, but from a historical point of view, and to be honest, for a classic racer, it's surprisingly cheap if you actually think about it. So would I recommend buying one? Well, I bought one myself, but I must admit the only reason why I did so was to include it in this series. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying the car unless you specifically just don't have this collector's piece, which incidentally it is a very good collector's piece from a historical point of view. But unless you're a collector or you specifically love the car or specifically love classic cars, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you break the bank for one of these. But overall, it's certainly not a bad car. It's just that the tuning options are a bit too limited to make it truly competitive, at least in the muscle car category. So that's it for this episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.